The following is part of Cornell Contemporary China Initiative Lecture Series under the Cornell East Asia program. The arguments and viewpoints of this talk belong solely to the speaker. We hope you enjoy. We're very happy to have with us Arianne Gaetano, a professor of anthropology and the director of the Women's Studies program at Auburn University in Auburn, Alabama, and Professor Gaetano finished her PhD at the University of Southern California in anthropology in
2005.
2005, and then had the opportunity to spend some time doing research in China on primarily focused on migrant women who were moving from rural areas to urban centers to work and to change their lives, and published a book on this topic in 2015 called Out to Work, a very in-depth look at the sort of life stories and strategies of these women moving from rural to urban places. So she was a natural choice for us to come talk a little about our general theme for the semester, and to tell us something maybe also about more updated work, which might have more to do with just urban lives, but we will stay tuned and find out. So please join me in welcoming Professor Gaetano.
Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. McNeil, for inviting me here, and for all of the individuals involved with the Cornell Contemporary China initiatives. It's great to be part of this lecture series, and thanks especially to Ms. Amala Lane for putting all the details together. I really appreciate it, because as director of a women's studies program, it's an administrative role. I'm quite busy, and I don't always get to interact with other faculty and students and share ideas. So this is really valuable. I'm going to see if this works now. So the title of my talk, I guess I cut out a word from the original, but Upwardly Mobile Women in Urban China Negotiating Gender Norms and Class. Okay, just bear with me, because I use a Mac, so it's a PC. So I don't have an outline of the talk, but basically I'm going to start with an introduction, focus on the topic, the research, the theoretical approach, and then give you some background to the issue, and then I'll introduce the research, and then a very short conclusion, which I hope you'll participate in the Q&A and give me some more stimulation ideas. So in today's presentation, I focus on two distinct social classes of women in urban China: college-educated urban women and much less well-educated, no more than high school and usually just middle school level education, rural migrant women. And in particular, those who are at or slightly over the normative age of first marriage, generally women from their mid-20s to their mid-30s who are still single, and therefore they are deeply thoughtful about work, marriage, and their future family, as these three topics are interrelated. Due to the high education and income of the former, and the migration or labor migration experience of the latter, I consider all of these women to be upwardly mobile and relatively privileged in terms of their social status, relative to previous generations of women, such as their mothers and grandmothers, and to other groups of women, such as non-college educated urban women, as well as never migrated rural women. I arrived at this topic, a confession, by happenstance, rather than as embarking on a planned comparative study. But I think there is some value to comparing these two populations. I believe they can tell us something about how gender norms and roles intersect with institutional structures of the state, the market, and the family, and shape individuals' social mobility pathways, and thus advance our understanding of the reproduction of inequality in urbanizing China. So over the past 10 years, I have been focused on studying changing attitudes towards marriage and the lives of unmarried adult women in Shanghai. Along with other scholars, I was intrigued by that disparaging discourse on so-called leftover women, or shengnu, that emerged in the media in the mid to late 2000s. The label referring to single urban women who had delayed marriage into their mid or late 20s. I interviewed some such women, mainly friends and friends of friends, casually in Beijing in 2008 when I was there for a month just to see the setup for the Beijing Olympics. But more seriously, I took on this research topic when I turned my focus to Shanghai over several summers between about 2012 and 2017, while I was also coordinating study abroad programs, internships for students at Auburn University, where I had been working. As a postdoctoral scholar from 2006 to 2010, prior to arriving at Auburn University, I conducted follow-up research for my dissertation focused on women who had successfully changed their residence from rural to urban and were entering the middle classes in provincial cities where they had settled and, say, the working class in Beijing as a result of their strategic marriage choices. And their stories then were largely the basis for the book whose cover is shown on the left there, published in 2015 that Dr. McNeil referred to. And then prior to that, between 1998 and 2002, I spent nearly 2 full years conducting dissertation fieldwork among second-generation rural to urban migrant women workers in Beijing's service sector. They were poorly educated, young, unmarried women who labored as domestic workers, hotel housekeepers, waitresses, and janitors. So in recent years, as the summary suggests, and as those publications indicate, I've been drawing upon all of this research, as well as the work of other scholars, to think more broadly about the interrelations between gender, urbanization, and inequality in China. So as I said, I think these two populations of women are good to think with about urbanization. And I refer to, with urbanization, I'm speaking about the emergent and shifting social, economic, and political identities and relationships in cities. So the whole kit and caboodle of urbanization. In light of ongoing efforts by feminist scholars to reorient theoretical focus of urban studies to include women's experiences and incorporate an intersectional gender perspective into analysis of urbanization. Feminist scholars of urbanization have cautioned about the tendency inherent in the ideology of modernity to view cities and towns as emancipatory spaces that bring prosperity to all due to the greater mobility and freedom, earning opportunities, and access to services that they offer. But in fact, the urban may not be a space of exploration and freedom for everyone equally. I think it's also important not to separate the anthropological study of marriage, family, and kinship from the study of urbanization. So considering this can complicate any presumption that urbanization and modernity lead to the dissolution of community ties and family ties and the inevitable rise of individualization, whether due to migration, the separation of the home and the workplace, job competition, housing insecurity, and status competition, etc. More generally, such an approach enables connecting the domestic sphere to the political economy, as well as considering the rural and the urban to be integrally connected and operating simultaneously. So this is a sort of critique of mainstream approaches that view the domestic sphere as a non-economic arena by revealing how family and households, including relations among household members, as well as the household structure, is integral to the economy, and as they are also responding to economic structures and changes. Further, viewing rural and urban as mutually imbricated in the same time plane is an important counterpart to this tendency to see the rural as static and the urban as dynamic. Integrating individuals' identities and agencies with broader social discourses, gender norms, and socioeconomic structures as developed in anthropological practice theory is also one of the goals I have, and highlighting changes that occur over an individual's life course. I've devoted myself to doing longitudinal research. And then kind of looking at these two approaches help us to explore complexities of women's identities and agency as they reflect and reproduce social structures and gender norms, and as these shift over the life course. And so just to summarize, I draw upon a lot of feminist anthropological scholarship, and I believe these this research then interrogates common assumptions and also offers us to focus on more details and nuances. So I will start with the assertion that socioeconomic changes wrought by state-directed urbanization, particularly in regard to education, migration and employment, and family size and structure. These changes intersect with gender and class to create both opportunities and constraints for urban and rural migrant women. I'm interested in how macro and meso level factors expand or limit choices. And at the micro level, I ask, what is the impact on differently positioned women's subjectivities, agencies, and life trajectories? How especially do they negotiate new opportunities for social mobility and personal autonomy amid a resurgence of patriarchal structures and gender norms? So where my studies dovetail, both rural migrant and urban women are defined primarily in relation to men. That is, it's really only through heterosexual marriage and their domestic role as future wives and mothers that women can achieve social identity and status as adult persons. This is both a cultural expectation and one that's reinforced by contemporary family and employment policies and structures, as well as media and propaganda. Migrating for employment and pursuing higher education to improve one's livelihood and career opportunities calls femininity into question, especially as it leads to marriage postponement and the possibility of never marrying at all. So shifts in social status, social class, entail a renegotiation of gender norms that also then become associated with that social class. Focusing on two different groups of women in urban China and the meanings, expectations, and attitudes they have about marriage and their futures highlights similarities and differences in their structural positioning and their agencies within the hegemonic system of gender, and so shed light on this intersectional perspective of gender, intersections of gender, class, and urbanization. Okay, so I'll give you some background. Might not be new to any of you, but okay, so just putting China's urbanization into historical context. So China's urbanization has been orchestrated by a very strong state and involves a gradual shift away from the totally planned economy of socialism towards a global neoliberal capitalism, characterized primarily by marketization and privatization. Simultaneously, to achieve development goals, the state has long enforced strict population planning that until very recently limited births among urban couples to just one child and to 2 or fewer births among rural couples. To further raise the so-called quality or suzhi of the population, or the human capital, to invest in human capital development, the state has mandated and invested in compulsory public education while expanding higher education access and opportunity. These policies and their consequences have engendered tremendous demographic and socioeconomic changes, which have profound, although different, consequences for these two groups of women, rural migrant women and urban women alike. Neoliberal economics stresses the importance of a flexible labor market and competition, and thus goes hand in hand with individualization, which emphasizes personal autonomy and independence from traditions and social institutions. In the socialist period, work units and collectives provided for citizens' daily existence and determined their futures to a large part, and strove to regulate individuals' thought and behaviors. In the post-socialist era, by contrast, the state condones and even encourages citizens to have private selves and indulge personal desires, so long as these do not directly conflict with their loyalty and obligations to the nation state. And as part of this trend toward individualization, Chinese women today, this is quoting Arthur Kleinman here, quest for a valued status, characterized by greater autonomy and control over their lives, including in marriage, along with the good life, generally associated with middle-class lifestyles or social status. Education expansion, decreased family size, and increased investment in daughters' education create the conditions for these possibilities to become reality. In regard to employment, the policies of the past 3 decades have set into motion two seemingly contradictory trends: the outward labor migration of able-bodied working-age women, along with men, from the rural areas, and the inverse movement of urban women from the public sphere of employment back into the domestic sphere. These two trends are in fact united as ways the state positions women as a reserve and flexible labor force to achieve economic goals. Both the cheap labor of migrant workers and the unwaged labor of urban women in the household as wives and mothers help subsidize urban development. Such policies, along with occupational segregation by gender and gender discrimination in employment, contribute to a pronounced gender pay gap as well as the reinforcement of traditional gender norms. Gender inequality in employment policies and practices thus impede women's attainment of upward social mobility and personal autonomy and reinforces the centrality of marriage in their lives. The policies implemented to improve human capital likewise have had contradictory gendered effects. An unintended consequence of the population planning policies for over 3 decades in the context of cultural preference for sons and access to technologies of fetal sex identification and sex-selective abortions, as well as underreporting of girls' births, are missing girls. A severe male-female imbalance at birth that peaked in over a decade ago, and at 121 and fell to 115 in 2016. At the same time, the policy and its attendant propaganda are credited with decreasing son preference, both in rural and urban areas. In rural areas, smaller family size plus government support for compulsory education has enabled more daughters to receive the basic education alongside their brothers, and as a result, the education gender gap has greatly narrowed, almost disappeared. In urban areas where couples were restricted to just one child until 2015, parents transferred to their only daughters the emotional and material resources that formerly were distributed in favor of sons. Along with rising urban incomes and policies promoting the expansion of higher education, this has led to a surge in urban women's attainment of post-secondary degrees. And so, share of college students today is 50% to men, compared with just under 25% in 1980 at the start of the reforms. So as previously stated, migration, employment, and education are new pathways to social mobility that also promote individualization. Further, marriage has been a traditional social mobility pathway for women due to the cultural rule of hypergamy. This has different implications for migrant and urban women in the context of urbanization and the socioeconomic change, though. Migration for work connects rural women to superior prospective partners, including urban bachelors, although marrying away from home entails substantial risks. Meanwhile, time in the city decreases their prospects for a timely marriage to a hometown fellow. Thus, they feel great pressure to secure marriage in that short window of time when they're working in the city. Urban women's options in the marriage market paradoxically decrease with higher education and subsequent increase in socioeconomic status, as fewer men can meet cultural expectations of female hypergamy. In China, marriage is a strong social norm, so failure to find a suitable partner is a grave matter for young women and for their parents. It also concerns the state, which promotes and regulates marriage to ensure population equality and social stability, and also for the sake of procreation and addressing the very low birth rate. In short, gender complicates the social mobility pathways for both groups of women. Economic reform policies implemented over the past 3 decades prioritized industrial and urban development, which in turn produced sectorial and spatial disparities that propelled farmers into factories and rural youth to cities in search of higher incomes. The vast urban migrant labor force reaching, now it's over 260 million people, that's a 2012 figure. About 33% have been women, sometimes 50% in certain areas or certain streams of migration. This has been these migrant laborers have been the backbone of China's massive accumulation of capital, especially through their participation in low-wage, low-technology manufacturing. Young women from poor rural areas have been the predominant manual workers in foreign invested, export-oriented light industries, clustered in those special economic zones of the urban coastal regions and later inland areas. In China's largest cities, Shanghai and Beijing, migrants comprise as much as a third of the population. In cities, migrant women cluster in retail and service occupations of the non-state private sector, in the informal sector, enduring low wages, few employment benefits, lack of stability, and weak labor regulations. They migrate for a number of reasons, but primarily for economic benefit and social status improvement. So we can say they are seeking the good life. Migrant women's socioeconomic mobility is conditioned by gender as it intersects with institutionalized class inequality produced by China's system of household registration, or the hukou system. The implementation of reform and opening policies weakened the hukou system by allowing the temporary migration of rural residents to work in urban areas and these development zones. But it continued to construct a dual labor market by restricting most migrant workers to the non-state sector and even excluding them from certain occupations, thus relegating them to low-wage, low-skill, less desirable, dangerous, and dirty jobs, and limiting their access to urban welfare benefits, whether medical, housing, education, employment, or pensions. The dual labor market helps to maintain a migrant labor workforce that is cheap and flexible. Stuck in menial jobs without the benefits of urban welfare, most migrants are ineligible for legal urban residence, which requires the purchase of a home or some other large investment. Rather, they're dependent on their families, and thus the rural households bear the costs of social reproduction of the migrant workforce. Although socialism did improve rural women's lives greatly by addressing gender inequality in the public sphere, it didn't dismantle traditional gender ideologies and roles in the domestic sphere. Thus, women continue to shoulder primary responsibility for social reproduction in the household, including the work of house chores and child rearing. Migration has further exacerbated this aspect of gender inequality as wives, particularly young mothers or new mothers, are left behind by their migrant husbands and are responsible not only to tend to the young children and to the elderly in the family, but increasingly also to farm the family plot of land. And so according to the 2010 National Census, 53% of employed women were in the primary agricultural sector compared to 44% of men. So we see the feminization of agriculture in statistics. Likewise, only 20% of women were in industry compared to almost 30% of men. So gender ideologies and divisions of labor spill over into the public sphere of urban employment. Stereotyped for innate feminine traits of nimble fingers and docility, women from the rural areas have been the preferred workers on the assembly lines of foreign invested, export-oriented light industries, and later in cities like Beijing and Shanghai, they cluster in retail and service jobs, waitressing, domestic service. And both of these kinds of jobs, whether the light industrial or the service jobs, similarly require feminine talents forged by domesticity, the nimble fingers, the experience of housework and cleaning, domestic work. Wages in these occupations are lower than those earned by male migrant workers who tend toward the more lucrative heavy industry, construction, transport jobs. Migrant women workers, again in a 2010 survey, earn just 60% of the income of male migrant workers. Women are also less likely than men to be hired for or promoted to technical and supervisory positions. They're especially vulnerable to sexual harassment and abuse by typically male bosses, and to discriminatory job termination due to pregnancy. Such jobs also expose them to industrial pollutants and cleaning agents that are especially harmful to reproductive health. Long hours of repetitive manual labor, poor nutrition, subpar living conditions in crowded dorms or rented rooms away from city centers, along with homesickness and alienation, all pose proven physical and mental health risks. Nonetheless, young migrant women can parlay gender stereotypes into material and social advantages. The term eating spring rice refers to leveraging of youth, appearance, and femininity or sexuality for socioeconomic return. At the level of the individual, such a trade-off can be very empowering and effective. Indeed, young migrant women in my book study who were working in these low-wage service jobs even exaggerated their youthful naivete and feminine deference to win the favor of employers or supervisors in the expectation of improving work relations and work conditions, and sometimes that was successful for them. From a broader perspective, however, eating spring rice is merely a bargain with patriarchy rather than a full-on challenge to it. Young migrant women have few employment options other than feminized occupations that I've just listed: domestic service, entertainment, the beauty industry, food services, or sexual services. Paradoxically, these occupations are stigmatized because of an association with servility or with illicit sex, premarital, extramarital, commercial, you name it, and hence immorality. Migrant women who elect to undertake these jobs do so at the risk of a tainted reputation, which may harm their own self-esteem and also their family's status as measured by more conservative rural standards. Again, the migrant women workers of my study often dissembled when discussing their occupations with kin or co-villagers to protect their reputations as chaste maidens and to shield their family, especially to shield their family from harmful village gossip. So as I said before, young rural women seek to migrate for a host of reasons. As filial daughters, they wish to earn their own keep and relieve their families of an extra mouth to feed, and to raise funds to support family members' education or medical expenses. Yet they also have some non-economic desires, such as just to see the world, to have new life experiences, and to gain relevant skills, which requires relocating to urban centers, as these are considered the places of modernity and globalization. My own research, others' research as well, shows that earning independent income and generating remittances for their families, as well as exposing co-villagers to new opportunities and information, increases rural daughters' value and status among their kin and their bargaining power in their own families. Further, the urban environment equips migrant women with new knowledge about modern consumer practices, which they apply to their own bodies and lifestyles for their own pleasure, as well as to boost their confidence, to feel a degree of control and mastery over themselves and over their futures. They can benefit socially and materially by learning how to better assimilate to urban culture. For example, by adopting a more citified appearance and demeanor, which is more feminine and more sexualized, migrant women may avoid being singled out, stereotyped, and stigmatized as a country bumpkin, or menial laborer, or just as an outsider to the city. Cultivating a modern, feminine self-image also expands migrant women's employment options in a labor market that especially values youth, beauty, femininity, and sexuality, right? That's spring rice bowl. Such techniques can enable individual migrant women workers to improve their work conditions or increase their wages by shifting occupations. And it's also helpful to marriage prospects. However, they do so at the expense of reinforcing gender norms that undergird gender inequality and that also arguably reinforce class boundaries between urban and rural. Further, they cannot fully overcome their marginalization in urban society without broader changes in the political economy. Migration profoundly alters young migrant women's life course by raising expectations and possibilities for their future as determined by marriage. Rural migrant women desire to marry to fulfill traditional social expectations. Indeed, marriage and motherhood are essential to women's gender identity, personhood, and passage to adulthood. Unmarried women are a rarity who are ostracized as old maids, and childless women may also be stigmatized. Pragmatically, marriage is key to women's future economic security. A migrant woman would be hard-pressed to support herself long-term, either in the city or in the countryside. Migrant work is precarious, and it provides very limited social insurance, if any. Migrant women workers are vulnerable to both gender and age discrimination. Further, marriage is the primary means by which women acquire property, especially in rural areas where daughters' inheritance rights are not usually well enforced. Marriage is a prerequisite for bearing offspring, which is important for future security. Childbearing outside of marriage is socially unacceptable and legally complicated. The traditional intergenerational contract and value of filial piety, whereby children are expected to provide for their parents in old age, persists and is even enshrined in the Constitution, promoted in propaganda, and enforced through law. So migration impacts rural women's vision of the ideal marriage and enables many of them to choose their own marital partner independent of parental influence. Young migrant women hope for a marriage that meets their romantic as well as pragmatic aspirations. They firmly reject agriculturalists as prospective spouses. They desire someone who has been a migrant worker with whom they can communicate about shared experience, and because it indicates ambition and grit, as well as future potential, as he should have acquired marketable skills, technical training, or work experience. Migration also provides many opportunities to meet and date fellow migrants. Through their workplaces and residences, whether in dormitories or in migrant enclaves in the city, young migrant women come into contact with many more prospective partners than would be available at home. Away from the watchful eyes of their parents, with some discretionary income, they can experiment with dating and enjoy leisurely courtship. Studies indicate that migrant women have more liberal views on premarital sex than their non-migrant peers. They're knowledgeable about prevention of STDs and HIV. But they are also at greater risk of unwanted pregnancy. As migrant women devote years to working away from home, they tend to marry later than their non-migrant peers. But as I said before, postponing marriage is a risk. As a woman ages, she has fewer potential mates available to her. Also, she risks aging out of the local marriage market, as men prefer to marry women slightly younger than themselves. Moreover, due to the conservative gender norms and even misogynist stigma against young women living and working independently of male kin and protectors, migrant women must carefully manage their reputations to avoid rejection by suitors who associate their lifestyle in the city with immorality. So again, they feel a lot of pressure to find a suitor in time and to maintain and protect their proper femininity. By young migrant women's criteria, marrying a co-migrant is ideal. Marrying a legal urban resident with local hukou and housing provides rural migrant women the right and the means to remain in the city. But the possibility of this sort of status hypergamy is limited by actual and perceived social and class differences between migrants and urban residents, by urban prejudice against outsiders, and just by opportunity. Such marriages tend to occur between exceptional migrant women and men considered economically and socially inferior by the standards of the urban marriage market, such as having low level of education and income. To some extent, rural women have an advantage over other women in this urban marriage market, because they are thought to embody more traditional feminine virtues of diligence, thrift, obedience, and purity. But they're also looked down upon as ignorant and shifty. In Shanghai in recent years, about 20,000 marriages annually occur between natives and outsiders. Due to the traditional preference for female hypergamy, it's likely that a majority are between Shanghai men and then women from other cities, towns, or villages. Migrant women who marry up in this fashion are not likely to enter the middle class directly, but their offspring might, as the family has access to subsidized housing, or already has housing, medical insurance, and education, good education. Choosing a marital partner independently of parents and from among a large pool of candidates encountered through migration affords rural migrant women potential to fulfill modern expectations for a companionate marriage, autonomy, and social mobility. In my own study, migrant women who married in this non-traditional way were able to continue living and working in the city after marriage. They didn't have to give that up. However, the precariousness of their jobs and lack of affordable housing and education meant they were often separated from their spouse or child, the latter typically left in the care of elderly relatives in the countryside. Unlike their traditional daughter-in-law living with and under the control of in-laws, my informants who married fellow migrants had autonomy and greater independence. Those who married into the city usually co-resided with in-laws, who in turn provided care for the grandchild. In all cases, married women continued working, and they used their earnings to support both their birth families and their in-laws, and so maintained autonomy while earning respect and gratitude from their extended families. Their lives also reflected acceptance of many middle-class values, such as small family, having just one child, emphasizing education, investing in their child's education, and home purchase. Rural migrant women spend their youth laboring away from their villages and parents, eating bitterness, and learning in the school of life. Their inferior social and economic status relative to urban residents, which results from the dual labor market, and their lack of urban hukou-based citizenship, combined with gender inequality in employment, precludes them from remaining single or settling in the city long term. Yet their outlook on marriage is quite positive, as it aligns with their desires to fulfill traditional social expectations, as well as to pursue the good life through social mobility. They do attain a degree of control over their marital choices and their post-marital lives, though the demands of the labor market for flexible workers can lead to temporary breakup of the conjugal or nuclear household, causing emotional distancing and stress among family members. They do not reject traditional gender roles in the family, yet their independent income and physical distance from in-laws helps to preserve their autonomy and independence and exercise filial piety as they wish to. Interestingly, in regard to marital choice, migrant women have much more freedom and a large pool of available bachelors than do single women from Shanghai, who tend to experience greater parental intervention in their marriage choices and have a smaller pool of potential mates, as I'll explain next. So focusing on highly educated urban women. These women are the privileged beneficiaries of post-socialist reform and opening policies. Throughout China since the 1990s, women's educational attainment has been steadily increasing. In recent years, as I said, the gender gap in compulsory education levels, grades 1 through 9, has all but closed. Further, with the expansion of higher education undertaken first in 1998, the proportion of women in post-secondary education has also risen. As I said, more than half the tertiary graduates in 2015 were women. Overall, women's human capital stock, if you will, is still significantly less than men's. Women on average receive 1 year less of education than men in China. But education favors urban youth, especially those from the wealthiest cities. Thus, highly educated young urban women are an elite group who can capitalize on their privilege to attain professional employment and secure their place in the emergent middle class, and moreover pursue personal autonomy, a valued status. However, their socioeconomic advancement, as well as individualization, are hampered by gender segmentation and discrimination in the labor market, as well as by pressure to conform to traditional gender roles and norms regarding marriage and family, all of which reflect and reinforce a broader resurgence of societal gender inequality. Women's liberation from family patriarchy through participation in employment was the hallmark of socialism, or a hallmark of socialism. By the late 1970s, nearly 90% of working-age women in the cities were in the workforce. Yet since 1990, despite post-socialist economic growth, women's overall labor force presence has been declining. According to the National Census in 2010, the rate of employment for women between the ages of 20 and 59 was 84% in 1990 and less than 74% in 2010. Urban working age women's share of the labor force has decreased most dramatically, from 77% in 1990 to, again, 60% in 2010, more than 10% less. Part of the decline is attributable to China's transition from a labor-intensive economy to a goods and services economy, but government policies and gender ideologies are also significant factors in this imbalance. The decentralization of industry has given greater freedom and flexibility to managers who may exercise gender discrimination. The economic restructuring of underperforming and inefficient state-owned enterprises, which was a condition for China to join the WTO in 2003, resulted in over 30 million job losses. So women were disproportionately made redundant, often at the peak of their productive years, and had greater difficulty finding reemployment. In contrast to revolutionary socialist propaganda, official discourse today emphasizes urban women's gender roles in the domestic sphere. For example, the state supports the retraining of those laid-off women workers in really feminized fields like household economics or domestic work, basically, which reinforces. Seems the computer wants to do an update. So that reinforces traditional gender roles and divisions of labor. Meanwhile, the government has withdrawn much of its support for working mothers with young children, such as subsidized health care and childcare. Housework and child-rearing duties are unequally shared between the sexes, even among two income-earning couples. Even among two income-earning couples, women still do a larger share of the housework. Urban women are also pressured to meet new middle-class standards of consumption. Although some can afford to hire others, such as migrant women, as substitutes for their own domestic labor, they are nonetheless expected to shoulder new responsibilities of household management and scientific mothering or scientific child-rearing, attentive parenting to ensure their offspring's physical fitness and educational success. In the media, career women are often portrayed as bad mothers. So no wonder urban working women feel challenged to balance their careers with their family, with their marriage and family. In the urban labor market, as in the migrant labor market, gender inequality is reflected in a pronounced gender pay gap that is only partly explained by women's overall lower level of education and work experience relative to men. The horizontal and vertical segregation of occupations by gender, a characteristic of the economy that has increased since socialism, accounts for some of the discrepancy. For example, women are more likely found in occupations considered light and unskilled. Women also face blatant gender discrimination in hiring and promotion. Employers reportedly avoid hiring young women who have not yet married or had children so as not to incur the expense of state-mandated paid maternity leave or child care costs. And reportedly this has increased now that everyone's encouraged and allowed to have 2 children. Similarly, some women report being fired at pregnancy. Gender stereotypes and a masculine business culture may also impede women's advancement to managerial and leadership positions. For example, women are perceived as less suited to business travel and socializing with clients after office hours. Compounding gender inequality, the official retirement age for women is still 5 years, set at 5 years younger than for men, which reinforces the message that women are less integral to the public sphere than are men. Finally, research indicates that much of the gender pay gap in the urban labor market is due to a marriage and child penalty, as working mothers cut back on hours or opt out of the labor force or are pushed out. Married women's income is just 77% of that of married men's. Importantly, the gender pay gap is virtually non-existent between unmarried men and unmarried women workers. Moreover, it's smaller at the very top of the income scale, and unmarried women actually outpace single men in income and employment rates. Nonetheless, for most employed urban women, continued social mobility and long-term economic security requires marriage, even as it paradoxically contributes to women's overall lower earnings relative to men in the long run. As with rural women, marriage is the primary means by which urban women accrue property, a significant form of wealth in urban China. In cities like Shanghai, municipal policies restrict home purchases by those without local hukou to couples only. Many of the highly educated professional women whom I interviewed already owned property in Shanghai, purchased with parental help. Others fully expected to receive an intergenerational wealth transfer at marriage, when their parents would contribute to the purchase of a marital home. However, upon marriage, urban women and their parents often cede legal rights to property by allowing husbands to claim formal ownership of the property, in accordance with the traditional expectation that the groom provide the marital home, or the groom's family provide the marital home. By law, ownership is determined by documentation, property deeds, rather than financial contributions. So adherence to this patriarchal convention is particularly, patrilineal convention, is particularly harmful to women in the event of divorce. Moreover, marriage is a deeply held value for most Chinese, and a strong social norm from which few individuals wish to deviate, as I've said before. Indeed, the post-socialist trend of individualization has not obviously weakened marriage and family as it has in the West. In China, marriage is still universal, or nearly universal. Only a small fraction of the Chinese population is never married, and that percentage hasn't increased in the past 30 years. So by the age of 40 to 45, virtually all females are married, and only 5% of men are not. Yet since the 1990s, the average age at first marriage in China has steadily risen. And this is just a snippet from a couple of years, because I found this nice chart on a site. Especially in the large cities, a growing proportion of youth remain single into their late 20s and beyond. In Shanghai, for example, the average age of first marriage rose from 28.8 to 30.1 for men and 26.5 to 28.1 for women between these 3 years, 2010 and 2013, as reported by the Civil Affairs Bureau in this handy chart. Highly educated young women feel the greatest pressure to marry and start a family, just at the point when they're establishing their careers. That pressure is intensified by the combination of traditional gender norms that organize the marriage market, parental concern, and conservative government propaganda, as well as popular media, that admonish women who postpone marriage. As explained, China's marriage market reflects pervasive expectations for women of status hypergamy and also age hypergamy. The former reflects traditional patriarchal gender norms, whereby society perceives men who marry up as emasculated. The latter reflects a gender double standard of aging, whereby men prefer to marry younger women. Together, these prescriptions create a marriage squeeze, particularly for highly educated women over the age of 30. Indeed, the conundrum is illustrated by 2010 census data, which show that regardless of gender, the higher the individual's educational attainment, the higher the likelihood of their remaining unmarried. But for individuals at all educational levels, the increases in this likelihood are larger for women than for men. Further, research shows that it is education per se and not the time spent pursuing education, right? Postponing marriage while you're pursuing education, or the income, the high income that results from it, that is the main obstacle to marriage for well-educated women. This suggests that educated urban women are not disadvantaged simply by their later entry into the marriage market, but rather by men's outright rejection of women with higher education levels as potential marital partners. In accordance with normative marriage market expectations, parents wish for their precious only daughters to marry at the expected time and to someone of higher socioeconomic status. Some parents, particularly those with only daughters, endeavor to locate prospective partners for their children by participating in matchmaking corners. Government-sponsored events typically held in public spaces such as Shanghai's People's Park, where they can exchange information about their single children with other parents. State propaganda and popular discourse further compound the pressure on the educated urban women. Since the late 2000s, the media has focused much attention on them, even warning that those who postpone marriage beyond age 27 will literally become leftover women. Some scholars worry that this derogatory label and the government's campaign against marriage postponement will lead ever younger women to make hasty and regrettable marital choices and be less empowered to insist on their legal rights to joint ownership of marital property. And I do note there's been a shift in some of the media portrayals, like the SK2 brand of cosmetics that actually sort of celebrates marriage postponement and the inner beauty of women. But there's still a lot of pressure on these women. My research among highly educated urban career women indicates that most do aspire to marry, but they're very ambivalent about marriage. Those whom I've interviewed, have been rather hesitant to marry because it involves an inevitable transition to adulthood without sufficient time to really enjoy their relatively carefree and independent youth. Marriage entails the acceptance of a host of new obligations associated with domestic and reproductive roles, for which they would need to develop special domestic skills along with interpersonal and emotional competencies. Although they sought spouses who would participate equally in housework, they also recognized that women typically shoulder a disproportionate share of domestic duties after marriage. In China, conventionally, childbirth follows within a year or two of marriage, and child rearing, especially today, exacts a huge sacrifice from mothers. Elder care support is an additional responsibility that looms on the far horizon, and which is increasingly shouldered by women. The daughters born under the one-child birth planning policy, in particular, have the burden, the additional burden, not just of attending to the caretaking needs of their own parents, of caring for their own parents in addition to their in-laws. Marriage and motherhood thus promise to constrain a woman's social world, decreasing the time and energy for peer relationships, or peer social networks, and for leisure pursuits. Finally, these women are wary of marriage because of concerns about the stability of the institution itself in the current market society, given evidence of increasing adultery and rising rates of divorce and marital instability in general. Another reason that educated urban women feel ambivalent about marriage is due to their rejection of many conservative gender norms that guide the marriage market and influence prospective partners' expectations. As among rural women, the ideal marriage envisioned by highly educated urban women is a companionate marriage between equals. Although the urban women in my study desired romance in their relationships, especially at the courtship stage, in marriage they did not seek a passionate love or lust based only on chemistry and mutual attraction, because they anticipated that would be short-lived. Rather, they intended to build a marriage from a longer-lasting mutual affection, a mature love. They eschewed unruly passions, but they desired their spouse to have a good degree of emotional competency or emotional intelligence to facilitate open communication, mutual understanding. They were turned off by potential partners who displayed chauvinism, arrogance, and excessive concern about superficial appearances and reputation, being concerned with their face, their image. They wished their future spouse to be supportive of their career and to share in housework and child-rearing duties. They also sought a partner who would not care about his bride being slightly older than him in age or slightly more educated or from a higher status family or earning a higher income. Finally, while they expected their partner to have a college degree and respectable employment and income, they avoided those who were too successful, too materialistic. They admired a man who was willing to split the wedding costs and allow his bride to maintain her own property assets. In a nutshell, they opposed the man who seeks the soft and passive or wenro traditional housewife, and yet were wary of the man who seeks only his own pleasure and fortune and shirks his traditional family obligations. Unfortunately, most men that they had met did not share their rather gender egalitarian, optimistic views. A general consensus among highly educated women in my own research, as well as in studies by others, was expressed to me in the words of this one interviewee in 2012, a 26-year-old PhD holder and Shanghai resident. As she said, a lot of guys are self-centered. They are miserly. They're not very tolerant. They'll tell you how a woman should be, that she should do household chores, and that she should be soft and pliant. So in summary, highly educated urban women desire to marry for personal satisfaction in order not to disappoint their parents, with whom they have very close emotional bonds, particularly those only daughters. And it is, because of this close emotional bond, mutual bond between parents and only daughters, it's for this reason that these young women are very open to parental involvement in matchmaking, very different from rural migrant women who are making their marriage by their own choices. However, they're also ambivalent about marriage. So first, there's a mismatch between societal and parental expectations of status and age hypergamy, and then their own aspirations for a more gender egalitarian homogamous marriage. Second, they suspect that their aspirations for a valued status, for personal autonomy and equality in marriage will be compromised in postmarital life due to societal expectations to conform to certain inflexible gender roles and the lack of external supports that would enable them to better maintain their independence and their careers after marriage. In short, highly educated urban women face the ongoing dilemma. Right? To lower their expectations of their education and labor market outcomes to fit the traditional wifely role, or to persevere in their educational and career pursuits, but forgo marriage. And that's a real personal dilemma, and it's also a moral dilemma. And increasingly I find that as I've doing longitudinal research, in part because I'm only spending short summers at a time in Shanghai, and I follow up, and many of my informants from 2012 continue to postpone marriage, and I've met women into their 40s now who are not married and are unlikely to ever marry. And I find that as time goes by, they are more and more committed to their own individualization, at least to personal autonomy and to their career, and to finding someone who really fits the bill, fits the profile they're looking for, a perfect spouse. Okay, so these are my short conclusions here to bring these two together. And after delivering this, and I've written in this structure in a recent publication, I have to say I really should go back and merge rural to urban back and forth to make it maybe a little more clear, the comparisons among them. On the themes of urbanization, I think some of the propaganda is very fitting, right? That humanity builds the city, and the city uplifts humanity. makes humanity prosperous. So in conclusion, clearly state policies and their outcomes have complicated influence on the upward mobility, autonomy, and individualization of both young migrant women workers and urban professional single women, albeit not uniformly due to their different positions in the social structure. Social mobility is an aspirational ideology that is associated with urban middle-class lifestyles. It is more difficult, if not impossible, for rural migrant women to attain that due to their inferior economic resources and social exclusion, except through hypergamy. In contrast, educated urban women are afforded ample opportunity and resources to be upwardly mobile and solidly middle class, but they face many obstacles in pursuing their aspirations to fulfill both filial obligations and filial desire, as well as their personal goals and desires for a companionate marriage. Social mobility pathways are gendered in that they reflect but also challenge gender ideologies and roles. Significantly, post-socialist China is undergoing a resurgence of traditional patriarchal gender norms. Upwardly mobile women are perceived as out of place and improper because they are not confined to a domestic role and even compete with men in the public sphere. As they appear to transgress essentialist gender roles and ideals, young migrant women workers and highly educated urban career women alike may face societal stigmatization, and they do face societal stigmatization. Rural migrant women are frequently relegated to low-status jobs that tarnish their reputations because of associations with servility and/or sex, or illicit sex. Yet they derive personal satisfaction from their experiences of migration and work, and they are empowered to exercise greater autonomy regarding marriage choices and in their post-marital family roles, whether in the sort of provincial city entering the middle class or in the cities really in the working class. Educated single urban women are stigmatized as leftover women. In both official media and popular culture, they are negatively depicted as too fickle and materialistic, as if they alone are responsible for their failure to marry. In fact, their single status is largely due to the rigid gender norms that underpin the marriage market rules and guide potential partners' expectations. Societal gender inequality that forces such women to have to choose between career and family roles compounds their ambivalence towards marriage. Some may capitulate to gender norms and accept traditional unequal marriages, but others will seek alternatives that allow them to maintain their independence, including marrying down, marrying abroad, or forgoing marriage altogether. Thank you. That's it.